Hi everyone, my name is Felix Slade. I work for Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. My job is the OxNet Administrator. What that means is I work in access and outreach, so I work very extensively with schools across the UK, and in particular with Year 12s and Year 13s who are looking to apply to competitive universities like Oxford and Cambridge. This is one of 3 webinars which are designed to teach you how to write to a university standard and how to make yourself stand out if you are sitting anything like admissions tests or writing personal statements or anything like that. And the webinars are going to cover 3 topics. One is going to be academic writing, one is going to be on presenting an argument, and the last one is going to be analysing a source. So what I'm going to cover with you today is going to be a webinar on academic writing, with an aim of teaching you how to present your arguments in a respectable and decent way that will make you be taken seriously by anybody who reads your work. Just so you know, I mean, before working at the university, I spent a long time as a teacher. So the way that I'm going to teach this is on the basis of what I've seen and what I continue to see as a teacher when I read students' work who are in Year 12 and who are in Year 13, as well as what I know impresses good universities, such as Oxford, Cambridge, those in London, Durham, Edinburgh, all those sorts of universities. So I hope that you find this useful. The aim of this is for it to take about 20 or 30 minutes and to give you some kind of takeaway tips on what you can do to write effectively in anything that you have to. So I'm going to share my screen with you and I'm going to take you through a presentation on academic writing. So, as you can see, my name is Felix. As I said, I work on a project called OxNet, and I work at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford, which is one of 38 constituent colleges and halls of the university. So, what I'd like to start this with is a quote from George Orwell, and this is one of 2 quotes that I am going to cite during this presentation. I promise that's it. But Orwell wrote something in 1947 about how to write effectively in a paper or an essay called Politics and the English Language. And a lot of what he wrote then is actually very relevant and applicable to what I'm going to say today. So in his introduction, something that Orwell says is modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits which spread by imitation and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. If one gets rid of these habits, one can think more clearly, and to think clearly is a necessary first step towards political regeneration. So that the fight against bad English is not frivolous and is not the exclusive concern of professional writers. What he's saying is anybody can train themselves to be a good writer, and this shouldn't just be something that is limited to professional writers. What he's also saying is that we all get into bad habits, and whether that's in 1947 or 2020, I think you'll probably agree with me that people do get into bad habits with writing, and in particular with expressing themselves. People say and write things that don't mean anything, and they become so embedded in our vocabulary that we kind of deploy them without thinking about what we're saying. One example of this a few years ago was use of the word random to describe everything. You're so random, it's so random, without really recognising what random meant, to the point where it denigrated the whole meaning of the word. Literally is another example of this, when everyone describes something as being literally amazing or literally awful. And again, the meaning of the word has worn away. So what I'm hoping to do today is to share some tips on how to use language more effectively, get rid of those bad habits, and to help you to write to the best way that you can. And there's a few things I'm going to cover as part of that. I'm going to cover the key principles of what good academic writing at a university or good A-level standard should have. I'm going to look at central aspects of effective writing and some common errors that come up quite a lot in the work that I read and a lot of the work that I mark. I'm going to show you some examples of strong and weak practice, and then we're going to look at how to rewrite examples of weak practice to make sure that communication is as efficient and effective as possible. And finally, I'll share some final thoughts with you, which should sum up everything that I've said today. As I said, this should take between 20 minutes and 30 minutes, so it's not too long. And again, I hope you find it interesting. So, key principles of good writing. I've divided this into 2 broad sections. The first is what good writing should do. And there are a few things that I think, and that I think a lot of colleagues would agree, good writing should do. It should be concise. You should not be writing on and on and on, or using 3 words where you could use 1. Good writing is succinct. It tells you exactly what it wants to in the fewest words possible, and it does it in a punchy way. It should be precise. You should be using words that you know the meaning of and words that actually mean something. When you are writing about a historical period, instead of saying people, you should be writing which people you're talking about. You know, were they Christians? Were they Muslims? Were they rebels? Were they royalists? These are the sorts of words you should be employing. And that's what I mean when I say precision when you're using your language. It should avoid cliches. I've mentioned the words literally and random as two examples of this, but there's all sorts of things that people include in their writing in an academic context that they shouldn't. Things like at the end of the day, I personally believe, personally being the cliche there, and all sorts of other cliches that people use that don't really mean anything. It should be grammatically pristine. I use the word pristine instead of precise because I mean pristine. If you are writing to a standard that should impress good universities, your grammar should be on point. You should be using commas effectively. You should be using full stops and paragraphs effectively. And basically the way that you write reflects how you present your thoughts and how you're presenting your ideas. So if you want your thoughts and ideas taken seriously, the grammar needs to be spot on. I mean, I've read work recently where the letter I for I think hasn't been capitalized. I've read pieces of writing where apostrophes are in the wrong place. So one thing that people often get wrong is apostrophe in its, I-T-S. If you're using its in a possessive form, it does not need an apostrophe. If you are writing it is, it does need an apostrophe. So on its own would not have an apostrophe because you're saying it's the possessive instead of saying it is. So things like this are really important and things you need to look out for. Good writing should be organised coherently. You should have paragraphs that make sense. You should be not repeating yourself in the sentences that you're writing one after another. And it should be laid out in a way that the reader can follow what it is that you're saying. And language is very important in that. It should use language which is simple and efficient. You shouldn't be overcomplicating what you're saying. You should be trying to convey your point of view in the simplest language possible, as if a non-specialist and someone who knew nothing about what you're writing about would be able to access your ideas. It is more impressive to put a complicated idea across in simple terms than it is to put it in flowery language that doesn't really mean anything. Simple is good, efficient is good. You want simple, short sentences that get your point across with precise language. As I said before, it should guide the reader through the argument. The person who's reading your essay shouldn't have to try and rescan it or reread it to figure out what it is you're saying. It should guide the reader through the layers of your argument, what it is you are saying, and how you're getting to your conclusions that you reach at the end of your essay. And finally, your good writing, or anyone's good writing, should be convincing and compelling. And really everything that I've put on that slide leads to this. If you're concise, if you're precise, if your grammar is on point, and if it's organised using efficient language that helps the reader guides the reader through what it is that you're arguing, it will be convincing and it will be compelling. Conversely, there are lots of things that good writing should not be or should not do. One thing that good writing should not do is be overcomplicated. I mentioned this in the last slide when I was talking about being precise and concise. This is a similar idea. You should not overcomplicate what it is you want to say. Keep it simple, and I've got some examples of this later. You should not be using very long sentences or paragraphs. If you realise that you are writing a long sentence, you should pause, read it aloud under your breath in a whisper, if you're in exam conditions, if you will. If you're struggling to take a breath by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you either need to split it into 2 or 3 sentences, or add a comma or a semicolon or something like that. Another point on semicolons, if you are going to use them, a semicolon should either break up 2 equal parts of a sentence with roughly the same number of syllables, or it should separate items in a list after you've used a colon. So if I was going to say, for example, the ingredients of pancakes are, colon, eggs, semicolon, flour, semicolon, milk, semicolon, and salt. Those are the 2 ways to use a semicolon. Good writing should not rely on meaningless additions to sentences. So one example of this, which is a pet peeve of mine, is I personally believe. If you say I believe, we know you personally believe it. You don't need to say personally. You can just say I believe. It lowers the caliber of what you're writing if you add I personally believe as opposed to just I believe. This actually means, actually is a meaningless word. It means absolutely nothing whatsoever. Your writing can be more concise and efficient just by saying this means instead of this actually means. And another example of this is categorically untrue. You don't need the categorically. You can just say this is untrue, and it's much more convincing and much more punchy doing it that way. So good writing should not rely on meaningless addition of sentences. It should not include vague nouns, another pet peeve of mine. So things, people, society. If you're saying things, think what the thing is and say that thing instead of saying things. So if I were to say, for example, there are a lot of things about the bus being late that annoy me, what I could say is there are a lot of factors of the bus being late that irritate me, such as, and I would list those. I mean, that might not be a very good example, but another example might be there are lots of interesting things about Annie Ernaux's writing. What I could say is there are lots of interesting uses of language. There are lots of interesting narrative strategies or something like that about Annie Ernaux's language in her books. So these are examples of things you can do. Similarly, people, why say people when you can specify the type of people that you're talking about? I mentioned this in the last slide when I mentioned the example in history. So say, you know, Christians, Muslims, whatever you want to say, but mention who the people are. And finally, society. People throw society out there a lot without really quantifying what they mean by society. So one example of this might be a lot of people in society are angry about Brexit. Well, what aspect of society, which part of society, where in society? Society is a very broad term, which could mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Are you talking about British society? Are you talking about working class society? Are you talking about wealthy echelons of society? Be very precise when you use the word society and say which aspect of it you are talking about, and it will make your writing much more convincing. And finally, good writing should not be imprecise. So a few examples of this are people who say things like throughout history, for a long time, for decades, in women's literature, across France, or anything like that. The risk of doing this is it makes it look like you don't know which aspect of history or which part of women's literature or which part of France you're talking about. You're kind of throwing out vague terms that don't really shape your writing in any meaningful way. Instead of saying throughout history, say the parts of history you're talking about, be precise. For decades, well, which decades? Are we talking the 60s, the 70s, the 80s? When are you talking about women's literature? What type of women's literature? All sorts of women write literature. You need to say what kind of literature you're talking about. And again, across France is another example. Say where in France, you know. If you don't know, don't say it and find a different way to say it. Otherwise you risk falling at the first hurdle. So just to kind of wrap up and kind of add a bit on to what I said in the last slide about central aspects of effective writing. To enhance your writing, I think the most important thing you can do is to plan what you are doing. If you know what you're writing about, it makes it much easier to write about it. If you know the structure of how you are going to present your argument, it means that the clarity of thoughts that you have in presenting your argument should transfer into clarity of writing. It is very obvious to markers when they are marking a piece of unplanned work. It comes across as disorganized, shambolic, if I will, and doesn't really make it very easy to read. If you plan very distinctly what it is you're going to argue and how you're going to argue it, your language will follow suit. And the next webinar on structuring your argument will talk more about planning your essay and how to go about presenting your argument. This really feeds into what I said in the last bullet point: organise your work well and efficient writing will follow. One tip I would give is about paragraph use. Each paragraph should address one distinct argument. If you find yourself melting into another argument halfway through a paragraph, start a new paragraph. It's difficult to follow a piece of work where there's lots and lots and lots of different ideas all in one very long paragraph. It's better to have shorter paragraphs, each with one very distinct idea in each of them, instead of having this big, long piece of work that makes it very difficult to read. And finally, again, my colleague will talk about this in more detail. Your introduction should contain similar content to your conclusion. When you are introducing your work, what you should be doing is stipulating what you are going to be arguing throughout your essay. You then argue it in your conclusion. You finish by saying, as I stated in my introduction, I have argued the following, and then kind of emphasise further on why that point is valid on the basis of what you've argued in more detail. Sentences should be short and succinct. They should not be long and rambling. You should get your point across in an effective, efficient, and shorthand way instead of going on and on and on and on and on. Don't use complex words when a simple word will suffice even. You should convey complicated ideas in simple terms. I've said this already, but it's really, really important. A lot of people who are writing essays or long pieces of work for admissions purposes or in their A-level work think that by using complicated language, they will come across as better. And actually, it's precision of language which is more impressive. So are you getting across what you want to say in a single word, or do you have to use 3 or 4 words in a really big, long sentence? The former is much more impressive than the latter. Be succinct. Short sentences are good. They're easier to read and they're punchier in putting an argument across. Don't use meaningless adjectives or adverbs. So things like stunningly interesting, fantastically brave. It's hyperbolic. It's uninteresting. It's not satisfying to read. Just say brave, just say interesting or anything like that if that's what you want to get across, but you don't need to add adverbs to adjectives just to make your work look better. Keep it simple. And as I said already, don't use 2 words for what you can express with 1. And don't make sweeping statements. Again, Holly will talk more about this when she talks about structuring your work and organising an argument, but this is really important. So I've got some examples of strong and weak practice that I'm going to show you in terms of academic writing. These are examples of work that I have marked and that I have thought are both good and bad examples of writing. So I'll follow in a second. What I want you to consider as you're reading this is what makes this good writing and what is effective about that writing. Conversely, what makes it bad writing? Why is it bad? And how could you rewrite the work to make it more convincing? Okay, I'm going to flip back. We've got 4 examples. I am going to read them aloud just in case there is anybody who is visually impaired. If you don't want to hear me reading aloud the passage, then by all means pause this, and what I'll do is I'll raise my hand after I finish reading it, and then you can kind of skip forward to that bit of the video. So, first essay question that I'm going to look at is, how can we say that the politics of migration has been driven by the far right over the last decade? And the response reads as follows. Whilst policymaking in a British context has remained largely in the hands of moderates, even despite the influence of the far right, it is significant to recognise the powerful role that Brexit has played in the politics of migration, most notably concerning popular response to immigration. Amidst harsher regulations for migrants at the beginning of the decade, the arrival of the Brexit referendum in 2016 saw the Leave campaign being principally characterised by a hostile attitude to immigration, in contrast to the Remain campaign, which warned against the negative economic impact of Brexit. Significantly, studies have shown that those with a strong national identity are less enthusiastic towards European integration, and that Euroscepticism is closely linked to negative attitudes towards minorities and immigrants. Such characteristics are also undoubtedly tied to the values of far-right parties such as the EDL, the BNP, and Britain First, all of which received more positive online attention following the referendum result. Now, do I think this is perfect writing? No. Do I think this is strong writing? Yes, I do. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all of this is one paragraph. You can see that there is one very distinct argument being made within that paragraph. Policymaking is the focus of it, as is the influence of the far right. And it's backed up consistently throughout that and argued in a very succinct way. I think the language is very precise, which is very satisfying to read. It doesn't use too many words where it could just use one. It's very well written in that respect. And the other thing that is good about it is it avoids vague nouns like things and people. And you can see this candidate's written things like such characteristics instead of such things. They've given examples of far-right parties, so such characteristics undoubtedly tied to the values of far-right parties instead of saying people, and then they've given examples of those far-right parties. So it's very precise and it gets across what it wants to in a very effective way by avoiding cliches. What I would change about this, I think some of the sentences are a bit too long and could be shortened. So the example I would cite is the one starting with amidst harsher regulations for migrants at the beginning of the decade, blah, 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 blah. It's very long. you could put a full stop after immigration here, and then just put, this is in contrast to the Remain campaign, which warned against. And then you've got two shorter sentences that get each distinct point across much more effectively in a much more punchy way. Okay, so let's move on to another example. The question was, is language sufficient to facilitate self-expression? And again, I'll raise my hand when I finish reading this aloud. So, language is key in everyone's life. As children, we are first taught to express what we feel and think through speaking and then writing. We are told to narrate and share with others in class our hopes and fears. These are forms of self-expression that are key and are valued in society, as writing is a cathartic process that many find stress-relieving. For example, Pascual Duarte, who was on the verge of execution as he was sentenced to death for murder, decided to write what he calls a publica confesión, a public confession. His confession is described to be dolorosa y urgente, painful and urgent, as he lived a life filled with violence and conflict, having watched his parents fight intensely, both verbally and physically, as well as being abused by his father. Therefore, we understand that writing is his only method of feeling relief and letting himself feel somewhat free from his sins and for the struggles in his life as he sat entre cuatro paredes, apremiando para muerte, between four walls urged by death. Similarly, Juan Francisco Manzano, the only known autobiographical account of Latin American slavery, decided to put his experience into writing, which is described as his process from serf to self. He secretly taught himself to read and write, and therefore he was able to differentiate himself and his experience from other slaves. In his manuscript, he underlines the word razón to illustrate that his experience as a slave was distinct as his mother received education and training. Now, I would argue that this is weak writing, and there are a few different reasons for that, which you probably should, I hope, have picked up by yourself as you were reading this. There's very vague terms in this that I don't like. I don't like language is key in everyone's life in the introduction. I think it's vague. I don't know what key means. Key could mean a number of things. And also everyone is very interesting to me. That needs specifying a bit further, I think. And even everyone's life, I think, is far too vague. It's not precise enough in what it's trying to say. I think the sentences are far too long. You probably heard me kind of struggling for breath as I got to the end of some of those. And the other thing that I'm not hugely keen on is this was presented as one of a 1.5 page paragraph in the piece of work that I read. What is particularly concerning to me is the fact that there are two distinct, different ideas being presented in the same paragraph. On the one hand, you've got a conversation about Pascual Duarte, and then in the same paragraph, someone is talking about Juan Francisco Manzano. They're two distinct ideas which should be separated into two distinct paragraphs. They should not be all in one thing. The language isn't precise, it's too long, the grammar's all over the place, and it just needs a lot of rewriting, and better planning would have made this paragraph much easier to read and a much more smoother journey for the reader. Okay, next one. Has capitalism been proven to fail? Capitalism is flawed as it is formed out of a system of exploitation which breeds rampant economic inequality and exacerbated existing inequities in society in accordance with race, gender and class, which manifests in scandals such as the gender wage gap, women earn 77% of a male counterpart's earnings, and discrimination against people of backgrounds not homogenised within the dominant culture, shown in hiring discrimination based on names. The ideology of a free market is undermined by the inherent systemic flaw of the accumulation of wealth which creates corporation culture. After accumulating capital, that select corporations emphasise and prioritise the profitability of their products at the cost of their ethical values. This consequently causes a multitude of ethical issues in order to fulfil supply and demand, depreciating the value of many labourers and their work, such as evidenced by the rampant utilisation of existing sweatshops. By undermining the value of workers, capitalism is ineffective in creating a sustainable economic model to benefit the majority due to its exploitative nature. Its flaws uncover a more deeply entrenched inequality, classism. Okay, so I would argue this is a weak example of writing, and there's a few reasons for that. From a grammatical point of view, there are lots of errors. Capitalism here is got a capital C. There's a semicolon here where there shouldn't be. There are missing S's, and the commas shouldn't be where they are. And the sentences are very, very, very long. There's a lot of repetition as well. There's imprecise language. And effectively, this is not communicating what it wants to effectively. Okay. Final example. Does inequality matter? When considering inequality to have a bivariate relationship with the contemporary world, it is said to breed discontent. Such discontent is ignited, according to the Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith, 1776, by the affluence of the rich, which excites the indignation of the poor, who are often both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. Intergenerational mobility is a measure of the relationship in parents and child's earnings over their lifetimes to determine the so-called head start one gets from having received endowments of capital that are determined by the reputation and connections of their families. This proxy shows the relative income advantage one child would have over another if one set of parents had twice the income of the other. It demonstrates that for the majority of countries, the more affluent gain larger amounts of human capital for early life success, and their gained bridging and linking social capital, family connections, further provide success in later life. It shows that the economic mobility of a family is significantly influenced by their own economic position in past generations, which is clearly discriminatory against those that start fresh in a new country. I would argue that despite the long sentences, this is otherwise a good example of writing. What I like about this is it takes complex ideas and explains them simply. You can see this mostly towards the end of the paragraph in the part that says, for example, it shows that the economic mobility of a family is significantly influenced by their own economic position in past generations. Very clear. Another example, this proxy shows the relative income advantage of one child would have over another if one set of parents had twice the income of the other. It takes a complicated idea and puts it simply. Yes, there are grammatical errors, but what I like about this is that the language is precise, it's largely concise despite long sentences, and overall it's argued relatively effectively. Now, what I'd like to do next is have a look at some of the weaker practices and suggest how I might rewrite those to make them more effective. So, this is an extract from Is Language Sufficient to Facilitate Self-Expression? The original essay wrote, "There are forms of self-expression that are key and are valued in society, as writing is a cathartic process that many find stress-relieving. I would suggest rewriting this too. Speaking and writing are the tenets of communication. Indeed, writing is a cathartic process." It says the same thing in fewer words in a more precise way. If she said something is cathartic, you don't need to say it's stress-relieving. The whole idea of something being cathartic is that it's an emotional outlet and helps you to feel better in what you're doing. You don't necessarily, therefore, need to explain it by saying it's stress-relieving. You can just say it's cathartic. I would argue that the shorter sentences puts the point across much more effectively. Another example from the same essay. Therefore, we understand that writing is his only method of feeling relief and letting himself feel somewhat free from his sins and for the struggles in his life as he sat entre cuatro paredes, apremiando para muerte, between four walls urged by death. Similarly, Juan Francisco Manzano, in the only and known of Latin American slavery, decided to put his experience into writing, which is described as his process from serf to self. First thing I've done is split this into two paragraphs. When the writer is talking about the second author, that should be a second paragraph. And the other thing I've done is I've tried to make the writing more concise. So my suggested edit of this is, we therefore understand that writing facilitates relief and frees him from his sins. Crucially, this sense of guilt is encapsulated by his description of his prison cell, entre cuatro paredes, apremiando para muerte. Similarly, Juan Francisco Manzano frames writing as a cathartic process in his autobiographical account of Latin American slavery. Indeed, he cites this process as being one that transports him from serf to self. It puts across the same idea in simpler, shorter language in a way that should be more convincing. Let's look at the other essay and have a look at a couple of suggested tweaks from that as well. So, a rather long excerpt that was provided was, "Capitalism is flawed as it is formed out of a system of exploitation which breeds rampant economic inequality and exacerbated existing inequities in society in accordance with race, gender and class, which manifests in scandals such as the gender wage gap. Women earn 77% of male counterparts' earnings, and discrimination against people of backgrounds not homogenized with dominant culture shown in hiring discrimination based on names." Take a breath. My suggestion is, capitalism is flawed as it is formed from a system of exploitation. This system both breeds economic inequality and exacerbates existing ruptures in social structures linked to race, gender, and class. An example of this is in the realm of employment in the workplace, where such inequality is apparent. One study cites that women earn 77% of their male counterpart salaries, and anecdotal stories bring light to the non-shortlisting of non-white candidates based on their names alone. Same ideas, much simpler. Last example. This consequently causes a multitude of ethical issues in order to fulfill supply and demand, depreciating the value of many labourers and their work, such as evidenced by the rampant utilisation of existing sweatshops. This clearly raises an important ethical question. How do large corporations balance the pressure of a profitable supply and demand model while protecting labour rights? The use of sweatshops is harrowing and provides fertile ground for wider discussions around the relationship between capitalism and corporate responsibility for employees. It's more effective, it's shorter, it avoids vague language, and it takes away some of the flowery fluff that doesn't really mean anything. Okay, I said I was going to do 2 quotes from Orwell. This is the last quote. If you simplify your English, you are freed from the worst follies of orthodoxy. You cannot speak of any of the necessary dialects, and when you make a stupid remark, its stupidity will be obvious, even to yourself. One cannot change this all in a moment, but one can at least change one's own habits, and from time to time, one can even, if one jeers loudly enough, send some worn out and useless phrase, some jackboot, Achilles heel, hotbed, melting point, acid test, veritable inferno, or other lump of verbal refuse into the dustbin where it belongs. I hope in this webinar I've been able to assist you in simplifying your English, presenting your work in a more concise and precise way, and I hope that I've put across how important it is to think about how you plan your work and how you convey what it is you want to say in a very effective way. Thank you for your time. I hope you have found this useful, and I would really recommend you watch the other 2 webinars that we are running, one on presenting an argument and the other one on how to analyse a source. Thank you very much.